Welcome back to Bizarre Sunday. This week, I am joined by Mark Matzke, who is a cryptozoologist, author, producer, but also a full-time pastor in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And if you're used to this show, you may recognize that we share a last name, as well as I'm pretty sure I share a lot of his genetic information. Is it half?
Pretty sure.
Is that how that works? I'm
What?
pretty sure because I don't know how genetics work.
Okay.
But that is my dad. And we are here today to talk about how do you as a Christian reconcile your interest in the paranormal or cryptozoology? How do you reconcile that with your Christianity? Now, before we get to that question, I would like you to tell our audience a little bit about your background with with cryptids, with the paranormal, kind of like what have you done with, that stuff?
Well, from a childhood interest in Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, and all of the attendant topics, because back in my day, there were usually like clearinghouse books that lumped all of those subjects together. That just got me reading a lot, watching a lot of TV about those subjects and so forth. But then that blended in with everything else that I was doing, both in terms of my undergraduate and then my graduate school. Things took a minor turn when I was in my Lutheran Confessions class one day, and Professor Kurt Marquardt, who is now with the Lord, but at the time that I was in seminary was still actively teaching, had a section about the supernatural, the paranormal, as part of, I believe, probably talking about the commandment, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, and sort of fleshing that out in a catechism sort of way. And as he was discussing the UFO topic in particular, which was mind-blowing in itself, he suggested to my seminary class that we read the book Operation Trojan Horse by John Keel, which blew me out of the water because I knew already at that time that Keel was also the author of a book called The Mothman Prophecies. And to have your very learned, very confessional, conservative seminary professor telling you should go read John Keel on this subject was a mind-expanding moment. And he wanted us to read it largely because it gave a completely secular sort of pseudo-scientific look at what the world thinks about the things of the spirit without using biblical terminology or language. And it does a great job of that. So fast forwarding that to probably around the year 2010, 2011, 2012, we were living in Southeast Ohio at the time, and there was a show that was on television called Finding Bigfoot that came to record an episode near where we lived. I took you to that filming. We met the cast, even participated in the shooting of that particular episode, were handed questions to ask from the crowd, which was a blast and a lot of fun. And at that point, I thought, that's about it. That's all that's going to come of this. And it really was. But we did go to the Ohio Bigfoot Conference for fun, which was about 45 minutes away from our house at Salt Fork State Park. And it was there one year that we met a young man and his father named Seth Breedlove, and Ronnie Breedlove was his dad. That turned into a podcast from that meeting called Sasquatch. At first a podcast and then simply a show about Bigfoot. At the same time, Seth was starting a very small independent production company called Small Town Monsters. They filmed a documentary called Minerva Monster based on Bigfoot stories in and around the Minerva, Ohio area. And the production took on a life of its own. It got AP press, which meant it was going all around the country, the story of them making this film. And at the time, I was continuing to record this podcast with Seth. And to make a long story short, he invited me and you to participate to varying degrees on different projects, which took us ultimately to places like Fouke, Arkansas, which was ground zero for the 1972 docudrama, The Legend of Boggy Creek. And so we traveled to Fouke, Arkansas. We ended up traveling to places like Elkhorn, Wisconsin, the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State a couple of times. And we also ended up in Maine at the International Cryptozoology Conference doing presentations the second time we were invited to go. And all of which has put me in touch with a number of eyewitnesses, a number of credentialed researchers, investigators, and authors, people who I grew up reading their books, like Lauren Coleman, for example, and Stan Gordon. Thanks to my involvement with Small Town Monsters, put me in touch with them to the point where we were driving them around in our car and just getting to know them individually as people. So I guess my curriculum vitae, as it were, in this whole area is based on the fact that my attachment to Small Town Monsters not only introduced me to sort of the leading minds in the field, but took you and me on location to these places, which is a really invaluable asset as far as coming to some conclusions on, is any of this really plausible? Forming your own sort of conclusions, or at least the start of an opinion about them. At the same time, since 1998, I've been serving in full-time ministry, and these questions don't come up a lot, but they do come up from time to time. And then when it's discovered that I, as a pastor, have more than just a quick take on the subject, that has tended to open doors for further conversations, not just among people that I might be serving, but people who get to know me through the media that's been created, and they'll text me, call me. This has happened with some regularity ever since, I've been spotted in Small Town Monsters productions, and from the beginning, it's been just out there that I'm a Christian pastor and interested in these things and helping people to try to come to terms with that. But what I've discovered is that there are a lot of Christian people who are interested to varying degrees, but a lot of them have never felt like they could really talk about it for whatever reason. And I think that tide is turning, if only slightly. So that's a little bit about why I have a foot in the door as I do.
How would you define cryptozoology? Is a place I want to start, because if we're
Sure.
going to talk about how do we reconcile these things, it's important that we define what we're reconciling.
Mm-hmm.
And I think our interest lies pretty strongly in what could very accurately be defined as cryptozoology. So from your approach, from your experience,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can give me as long or as short an answer as you want to what is it that we're trying to, people ask us, you're trying to reconcile this thing with your
Yes.
faith. What is that thing?
Sure. Well, cryptozoology, strictly defined, is the identification of animals that up to this point are unclassified. Lauren Coleman, who wrote Mysterious America and tons of other cryptozoological writings, runs the International Cryptozoology Museum, now in Bangor, Maine, has often talked about cryptozoology's immediate antecedent is something that he referred to as romantic biology. And what romantic biology is precisely going out and looking for specimens that have yet to be given a classification under the scientific methodologies involved in naming and classifying something new. So in that regard, it's really nothing more or less than looking to see if there are animals that we haven't clearly identified yet. And it's simply a demonstrable fact that there are animals that have evaded classification up to this point. They don't necessarily have to be huge animals, and people hear cryptozoology and they assume things like Bigfoot and the Yeti and the Loch Ness Monster, but cryptozoology can also rightly be discovering a new species of loris, or a slug, or a moth that no one has yet identified. That's as much cryptozoology as the other stuff.
I think something you and I we try to demonstrate or advocate for is that strict definition of cryptozoology.
Mm-hmm.
It's Bernard Heuvelmann's definition, right? The guy who coined the term, that's his definition. And just kind of as a respecter of words and terms,
Mm-hmm.
I kind of really cling to that strong definition. And there has been this shift in the last decade or two that cryptozoology and the line between what is cryptozoology, this romantic zoology, and folklore has been blurred. Folklore has always been given its credit in cryptozoology as a possible evidence to it, but something that really has taken over in these last few years is kind of folklore as historical preservation as cryptozoology. There's this weird kind of these overlapping disciplines where certainly there are folkloric elements, and I think folklore, just like, I wish I could give you, and maybe you could give our folks at home, a definition of like folklore literally just being like the stories we tell about people, places, things around us, and kind of how that gets enveloped into a society, into a group of people. And there's classifications within folklore itself that kind of delineate that line of truth or reality. So we don't fairy tale, a fable, well defined, you'd not expect to then go look for that thing in the wild. That kind of reforming cryptozoology idea is an idea that I think I'd need to get out of my head and out somewhere one of these days. Because I think, for folks at home, a lot of the people who listen to the show know me personally, and I think they know me as like a theology guy. But if there's one thing that I've thought about, that's second, or that like maybe if the way my mind works, that I've thought about a lot besides, the Bible and God, is this subject. And that's really like, talk about us going to these things as a kid and all that. It's like, it really was the first almost 2 decades of my life was kind of seriously thinking about these things and thinking how they might fit in with my worldview. And I think, having gone to places and talked to people, it wasn't as much like reconciling how this could possibly fit in my worldview. It was, well, what is really going on?
Mm-hmm.
I think, it's such an interesting place because it is. You have to make sure you're defining it right. If you're then, and I kind of want to hold off on this, but then when you start to get like the occult involved, the answer doesn't, change much. But we don't necessarily have an interest in the occult, and I think we can get to that in a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But well, or I can say it now. I heard it once. I think it was from one of my professors. Interestingly enough, online, talks about how the occult is religion without personal obligation. It's this idea that like you can get divination, you can get your answers, but you don't have to obey anybody or anything. And I think that's a very interesting idea.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's a no strings attached religion. And we're kind of winding up, I think, to our answer.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to, and maybe the answer's already showing itself, but I want to get your answer. I brought you on.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile your interest in unexplained animals and those stories, which could be described as folklore, the search, cryptozoology, the stories and myths that spring up around it? Well, myths wouldn't even be the right word. The kind of the urban legends that spring up around them. How do you reconcile that with your faith?
Sure. Well, it's a wonderful question, and I have to say I have done my fair share of questions and answer periods at the end of film screenings and so forth. And I've gotten to the point where I'm surprised when that question is not asked, because it's been asked so often, which reveals a lot. Good questions reveal a lot about motivation or what some of the presuppositions are. Before I get into my direct answer to that question, I would like to just acknowledge that what you said is absolutely true, which is that cryptozoology today has somehow taken on this larger umbrella term or meaning in people's minds, that it's no longer just simply or strictly sort of amateur or citizen scientists, if you will, going out and looking for type specimens and adding them to a collection, which really is sort of the origin of cryptozoology in many ways, and then writing about your findings, obviously. But in that bleed over with folklore, I think it's inevitable and fun, sort of hand in hand, to try to then talk about why, or what is it that we're really seeing. And it's in that very human desire to figure out what is happening that cryptozoology now encompasses the folkloric elements and, quite frankly, the paranormal elements. When I say paranormal, I'm just sort of using that as a blanket term to talk about things like hauntings and ghosts, creatures that would seem to defy even a undiscovered animal sort of definition. And here I'm thinking of, well, I mean, you fill in the blank, there's a lot of quote unquote cryptids that fit the bill of something that's not just another kind of bear, for example. But, it's something else is going on that defies that. And so then you get into, everyone wants something with explanatory power. Therefore, if the scientific material world isn't giving me that, then I'm going to go next to things like a paranormal origin for something, or a sort of cinematically influenced origin of something. Like there you get the government's making some sort of mutant in a lab and it escaped. I mean, now you're really crossing the streams of like conspiratorial thinking and cryptids. And I think that cryptid label, even if it was meant to be sort of confined to the cryptozoological space, has sort of opened the door to all these other sort of, oh, well, it could be this, it could be that. When originally it wasn't about finding out why or what's happening or how does this tie into some legend that was told, in our region. It was just, hey, I found this butterfly that no one else seems to have seen it before. So, how do you reconcile Christian faith with an interest in any of what we've talked about so far? And I think it begins with the fact that, and what I tell people, what I lead with, hoping to disarm the whole enterprise to a certain degree, is I don't see a need to reconcile my Christian faith with pursuing mysteries, because essentially the Christian faith is full of mysterious things. And all we have to do is plumb the depths of things like creedal statements, for example. The Apostles' Creed, which talks about God the Father Almighty who made heaven and earth, and Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit. In just those lines that I've spoken to you, there are infinite mystery. Like, how could the Son of God be conceived in a human womb? You can never get to the bottom of the mystery of that. As Christians, we're bound by what God has told us is true. And when what he has told us is ultimately a mystery, we gladly believe that, but we can't say how that is. And we need to be able at some point to say, I don't know how. I know that God has said this is the situation. And you could go as elemental as God himself has introduced himself as three persons in one divine essence. That's a mystery. It's a mystery that I celebrate, that I believe wholeheartedly. But to say, well, it's a mystery, therefore, why are you interested in it? Well, I mean, that's like asking, why are you interested in God? Why are you interested in the Bible? Because the Bible is chock full of mystery, and rightly defined, it's chock full of the supernatural. I mean, God is supernatural in the sense that he transcends the natural. He created the natural, but he doesn't have to operate by those rules, and often doesn't, at least as we understand the natural. So that's sort of my leading edge of how do you reconcile these two things. My immediate answer is, if you're talking about a worldview that includes supernatural elements, beings from other dimensions, quote unquote, there's nothing to reconcile. I believe that to begin with because I'm a Christian. The interesting thing to me is, why would it be perceived that that needs to be reconciled? And there's a whole history involved in that that is extremely interesting, because the weird situation that I'll just say 19th and 20th into the 21st century church has found itself in is this strange never land of biblical scholarship went in the direction of saying there is no supernatural.
Yeah. And that's a super important point that whenever I think about this, I can't get away from. Is you and I, we have our differences, and I think there's some fun, like, nuanced differences in the way you and I answer this question that confessional Lutheran and like confessionally Reformed answer in different ways. But we're both fundamentalists in the 20th century sense of the word. There was a time, and again, it's like kind of, we're more than Cliff Notes history saying this. There's a time when there was a lot of people who would call themselves theologians and Christians, some of which had very good intentions, wanted to remove the so-called supernatural from the Bible, and kind of, demythologize the Bible some, and try to get those things out, things like the virgin birth, things like Jesus's miracles, and something that, as Christians, the type of, in order for you to know anything about us, you need to know the type of Christians we are, and we are 100% Christians who believe in those things. We are Christians who believe in the supernatural. And what that means is both the extraordinary and that there is a real, immaterial world out there. It's funny you mentioned the Apostles' Creed, because I had the Nicene Creed pulled up. It talks about, God, the Father, creator of all things visible and invisible.
Yes.
And that's not because creeds are authoritative or anything like that, but they're helpful in seeing what Christians have believed for a very long time. And there you have Christians in the 300s, 400 AD, saying they believe in both the physical world and the invisible world, and all that has to come from that. And so when it comes, to me, kind of the surface level, how do I reconcile those things? One, when it comes to romantic zoology, cryptozoology, as we've defined it, to your point, what's there to reconcile? I mean, the largest thing might be Sasquatch, but I have thought a lot about that. I'm a literal creationist, and so God can do whatever he wants, and so he can make that. But when it comes to anything else, I'm fairly, and I haven't really answered anybody this way, and so I hope, like, I say this with kindness and love, but you have to take stuff from my worldview to introduce it, like these ideas. What I mean is, if we're going to start talking about ghosts or the afterlife or a soul, people's disembodied souls, you have left a secular materialist worldview behind, and you have now come into mine and start tinkering with some things. You have to take from the Christian worldview. It's a presuppositional apologetic through and through, but it applies perfectly to this, right? You have to take from the Christian worldview in order to even have the language to describe it. Because if you're operating from someone who, say, believes in evolution wholesale and fully subscribes to what, kind of the leading scientific consensus is. That's not to demean that viewpoint. I'm just trying to point out where I'm getting this from.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have to pretty much fully leave behind and fully deny the spiritual, that there's anything outside of the physical here and now, that there isn't any of that. The people who've come up with these ideas are pretty outspoken, and that's what they think. And so then to start talking about a soul, for example, you're using our stuff. You're using the Christian worldview. And I think that's super important. And then it really, we've glanced over it, but when it comes to cryptids and kind of strictly defined, because these days it comes in all shapes and forms, Mothman and Dogman and you name it. There is a lot of weird stuff, but I would very comfortably put that in the blanket of folklore and then kind of move on and go, and maybe I'm getting ahead of ourselves here, but if you put it in the realm of folklore, then to your point, you're no longer asking the questions of where did this come from? You're simply looking at the effect it's had on people, the stories that are being told. And I think that's what's been super impactful to me is regardless of what happened, regardless of the cause, you see, and I hope maybe if you're somebody who's closed-minded about all this stuff and fairly so, no judgment there, look at the real effect this has had on people and places. Which is, I think, a even more interesting question of if nothing is happening, then how is it having such a big effect across the map, right? Not just in not just in one location.
That's still something to be interested in.
And that's where my interest is, right? That's I think when it comes to, again, how do you reconcile your interest in this? It's well, to be honest, I've done a really bad job of being a front lines investigator of these things. That's not really my cup of tea. I'm much more that sort of folklorist historian to come in after, get the stories and see the impact it's had. And once you start doing that, it's really incredible. I've told the story several times, not recently, of when we were in southwestern Pennsylvania. We were on the property of this lady, and she had horses. And she would bring in her horses every night, which was not typical, because there was a Black Panther that was around. And if you don't know, Black Panthers are not native to southwestern PA. And here was this lady. She seemed, pretty level-headed.
Mm-hmm.
She was very nice. We didn't, I didn't do an in-depth psychological examination on this lady.
Yeah.
But her normal day-to-day life was affected by the appearance and by the proximity of a natural animal, not native to the area, that by all scientific accounts should not be there. Which is very interesting. In a very mundane way, right? She's not doing this and putting it on Facebook and TikTok and going, oh my goodness. It's kind of oh yeah, by the way, this is what's happening in my life. And it's what do you mean? So,
and it's not necessarily an extraordinary claim. It's just that there's a large predatory feline that's not, quote unquote, supposed to be there, that she is making changes in her life based on that. And I think that's a wonderful example of cryptozoology in terms of how we tend to think about it, because there's a whole school then of the mountain lion where, that you go on state websites and so forth, and there's claims made that, the mountain lion or the cougar has been eliminated in the state and it just doesn't live here. But then you get sightings and footprints of big cats and so forth. And again, mundane is a great word to use, because on one hand, no one would want to run into a mountain lion hiking in Northeast Ohio, for example. But if you did see one, it's not like a Sasquatch sighting, right? It's something else. But that would still grab your attention. You'd think about it every time you're going on a hike from that point forward.
Yeah, there are far less documentaries and YouTube videos on mountain lions, like out of place mountain lions.
Mm-hmm.
Great one is Lions of the East by
Yes.
Alex Petikoff, a good friend of ours. Does have a whole documentary on the subject that's very interesting, very insightful on have mountain lions really gone as extinct as the claims are. And that's cryptozoology. That's what our interest is. And it's still, hey, you still might think it's weird. Like, why is that your interest? But I mean, same as anything else. And I think there is another side to this, though. And I think personally, it's only fair to talk about this. Is there is the more out there stuff. I think of the stuff that happens on the Chestnut Ridge, Bridgewater Triangle, Night Siege, stuff that we're kind of mildly known for. That is a bit more out there. And for those who don't know, these are sightings of Sasquatch that have UFOs present at the same time, or little green men and Bigfoot and all these sorts of things. It's kind of, the blanket term these days is high strangeness. How do you reconcile high strangeness with, I mean, is it the same answer? Or is it when we start to get towards the fringe, where does your answer go? Or are you still not looking for a why? Does that still not a question that bothers you?
That's a well-asked question. I think that it doesn't bother me still. But having said that, when you start to get into the much stranger cases and the conflation of one very weird oddity with another in the same proximity, which was the researcher tied in with Project Blue Book, J. Allen Hynek, came up with that term, high strangeness. Again, for a specific purpose, and it's been co-opted, but he wanted to describe something when there was a UFO sighting and there was something else inexplicable happening at the same time and place. That's where high strangeness comes from. And so once again, high strangeness has morphed into this blanket term that just means a bunch of weird stuff thrown into a blender and sort of experienced even over time, even over the course of years in some cases. That's not strictly high strangeness per se, according to Hynek, but be that as it may, when you've got the weirder things, those tend to then go in the direction of the person, the human being on the receiving end of that experience. Their life can be affected in some rather dramatic ways. And that is when you get into places that I would describe as caution areas spiritually, especially when they're having experiences, say, like with a strange entity and something they perceive to be an alien or something of that nature. And it starts to tell them things that would lead them in a separate track from the revealed truth of Scripture. Now you're getting into potential causation that we would, I think, just have to describe in terms of demonic activity, deception. Because someone is not walking with God necessarily, and yet they're open to the supernatural, I believe that can be utilized to lead them into even more spiritually perilous place. So that a space brother, for example, which was a whole line of experience before the alien gray abduction thing was happening, the space brothers would appear and would essentially be talking to individual percipients as if they were gods. And let's just put it out there the way it's coming across, that they have the ability to change the course of this planet, that they're acting as protectors, often intervening with war or, nuclear facilities and things of that nature. And then if people would just follow them into this new era of peace, everything on earth would be okay. Well, on the face of it, that sounds like a positive message, right? Like, oh, that's who's really behind everything. And they get led along that pathway. That's clearly a separate pathway than what the revealed truth of God's word is telling us, who's really in control and who's actually calling the shots. And I think that is the caution for the Christian. If they're asking us, how do we reconcile this with that, they would have a point in sort of saying, isn't there any caution? Don't you have to take care with some of this? Absolutely you do, if it's leading you in the direction away from God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is the one true God and is responsible for this world, has redeemed people, and is still involved with the creation of his world. And then this person over here has the experience, whether it's with a space brother or a ghost or some disembodied voice telling them something other than that, then Scripture clearly would say, watch out, because that you're being deceived into a different area that behind the mask ultimately is evil, is Satan. So take care with that. And there's people going into those sort of fringe areas looking to have an experience, opening themselves up to whatever is out there, communicate with me, speak to me. Sometimes they're using objects to try to open themselves up to that, whether that's a Ouija board or a so-called spirit box. And that is always the caution, that when you open that door voluntarily, what's behind that door can come through and can do things that you have no control over once you've given that access. So there is definite caution in some of these areas. And to circle back to a point that you made earlier, things like divination are supplanting trust in God. That's a very simple thing. You just want to know the answer to the problem that you're facing so that you can take action that's going to lead to something that you think is more positive, but you're wresting control from God in doing that. So there's really a twofold not prescription, I can't think of the right word. What God is trying to do when he says don't do those things is really twofold. One, he's saying there is something to them. They're not meaningless. But more than that, just trust me rather than read in the tea leaves what you're supposed to do, or the stars for that matter. Something we haven't even touched on yet is astrology and those type of forms of fortune casting or future telling, but they're kind of rooted in the same ultimate problem, which is I don't really want to not know the answer. If I can know the answer, and if God's not going to give me the answer, then if somebody else or something else is telling me I can know that, human nature goes in that direction.
Well, yeah, and with things like with divination and sorcery, Christians, whether they know it or not, in the Bible have answers to those things that are not just dismissive answers. And what's so interesting to me, and I read this today, is sorcery is included in vice lists in Paul's writings. So what I'm saying there is Paul in his writings, and there might be other New Testament authors who do this, will talk about things that sin brings forth.
Mm-hmm.
And they're called vice lists because it's a bunch of bad things. One of those things is sorcery. And I'd like to look into that a bit more, but it's, to your point, all the other things on those lists are things like adultery, murder, anger, all very real things.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the very real things that comes from sin is like that mistrust. If it doesn't come from faith, it's sin. It's sorcery. It's divination. So we have these answers that aren't just, oh, they're not real,
Mm-hmm.
move on. It's stay away from them because they're dangerous and real.
Yeah.
And I think that's always really important as Christians to keep in mind when dealing with these things. And even like kind of what I was saying earlier, when it comes to things like ghosts, and then when it comes to something like possession, like, why would I want to deal with that? Why would I mean, and there's people who God has used who have been called and equipped to deal with those things. I don't want to be downright dismissive and like everyone stay away from, demon possession. But when it comes to those ideas, my worldview, my Christianity has the answers for those. And that the answer is nothing interesting. The answer is nothing I want to deal with, right? And interesting in the meaning of that I would generate intrigue, right? It's demonic. It's the very thing that wants to kill me all the time. And I know my God is strong and all-powerful, almighty, active on my behalf. But that doesn't mean I'm going to go running towards that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what's so interesting is in trying to find an answer, an all-encompassing answer to the paranormal outside of a Christian worldview, to the supernatural, like whatever blanket term you want to use to describe all this stuff, you end up in a spiritual place. Whether you realize it or not, you are making spiritual claims because you're dealing with something outside of yourself. And you're trying to get these big God-sized answers out of a small, unexplained thing. And it is so interesting how spiritual these conversations instantly get.
Mm-hmm.
I think, the last time you and I were both at one of these events, a Bigfoot conference, we didn't make it very far without a spiritual conversation with somebody. One, because we make our faith very, known.
Yeah.
I hope I boast in the Lord when I say that. That's kind of who we are first, obviously. Like your profession, I'm in school for Christian ministry. Oh, and we have an interest in cryptids. Is kind of how this works. So it's...
Yeah, and the interesting thing is about that is I can say I do not remember a time where I brought it up. But it's been brought up to me because, like you said, people know who we are to a certain degree if they're in these worlds. And it's led to some of the most disarming conversations that I can recall having, just in terms of people coming to the realization that they are seeking something spiritual. That maybe not would have been the way they described it themselves. But I've found that that's such a wonderful context for Christians to enter into, not wagging their fingers saying, you people have it all wrong. Oh my goodness, you're all serving the devil without knowing it. But to realize that they are on a spiritual, supernatural quest and journey for answers. And they're not even necessarily sure what they're looking for, but they're not materialist people at all.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing is I think if you're a modern person interested in cryptids, you are, unbeknownst to yourself, in the midst of, and hey, if you're listening to this and actually one of those people, I hope my word salad doesn't sound like sophistry, but take time. It's the way I can think of it. But there's worldview dissonance there. There's a worldview clash. This is kind of my unashamed apologetic for the Christian faith, right? Is if you are a person who believes in evolution, or if you're a person who doesn't necessarily think there's a God, then if you're interested in supernatural topics, whether you realize it or not, there's an oxymoron in there somewhere. Not calling you, but like there's there's an ironic statement somewhere. And I really do think that it's in your materialism, right? It's not in you. You're not the dissonance there. It's that there is a supernatural element to life that is undeniable, meaning that there is something beyond the here and now physical nature of the universe that manifests itself in the interest in the paranormal.
Yes.
Like and that's part of this is if we're having conversations with somebody who they're interested in the paranormal and they kind of come to one of us, typically you, they're met with somebody who unashamed and unshaken believes in a supernatural worldview.
Yeah.
That your worldview, my worldview, doesn't have to shift one bit to include the idea of a ghost.
Mm-hmm.
Now, to be fair, we don't think that once somebody dies, their soul haunts a place. But, like the idea of a spirit of a person,
Mm-hmm.
a soul, is not a new idea. That's like my worldview has one of those.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not a new idea. And so if you're left with these questions after hearing us, like, please reach out to us. We'd happily answer them, talk to you about them, because that's what we're here for.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the thing is, I hope this doesn't come off as prideful or anything like that, but I believe my worldview has answers to these questions, and that the realm of cryptozoology and the paranormal fits within my worldview easily.
Yeah. Yes. And I used the word disarming before to describe those conversations. And what I meant by that was I think people walk away authentically surprised that my answer was what you just said, that supernatural worldview, 100%. There's beings, both good and evil, that we normally don't see or sense, but they could manifest themselves at any time into our reality. Angels, demons, no problem. And what makes me sad about that is the fact that they came to that conversation presuming I didn't believe that. How did the church get to the point where people just living their lives would presume a Christian pastor would think, oh, there's no such thing? And we've hinted around and just scratched the surface of the historical reality of how that happened. But I feel like it's just been part of my platform, such as it is, through STM, has been just to make that little break in the wall that a secular person or a person with church in their background, but they haven't gone in a long time, can hear a Christian pastor who's been at this for decades say, without reservation, faith is grounded in supernatural reality. No apologies. And what my hope is that will create a little shaft of light through the wall for them to see, okay, really? Well, tell me more about that. And we've had those opportunities, I think, both of us, to a certain degree, to say those things. A triune God, the person of Jesus, true God and true man, both at the same time. Can I tell you how that works? Absolutely not. But I can tell you what God has said about it and why it's important, and let you think about that. And that there's so many people out there who think that organized Christianity has abandoned the concept of the spiritual. And maybe that's at the heart of the objection that we hear so often, that I'm not into organized religion, but I'm a spiritual person. Well, I'm into organized religion, but I'm spiritual too. Let's talk about the spiritual stuff that makes you spiritual. And I think what people find is that there is a lot in common, which is a great place to start, and just build a relationship with that person as well. It's so wild to me that, because I've heard this too from another sort of angle, that people have brought situations to their pastors having to do with supernatural, paranormal stuff, and the advice they get back is, oh, there's no such thing, from a pastor. Like, just setting aside the pastoral sensitivity to the person you're supposed to be serving, you would at least give them a benefit of the doubt, I think, and try to walk through that with them. But to just dismiss that outright as, oh, you can't be having that experience that you're describing, that's really unfortunate. And that's one of the things I'm hopefully dispelling, along with all the other myriad concerns that a pastor has on a weekly basis.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time and coming out and talking with us. If you are interested in hearing more about this, any follow-up questions that you'd want to be public, leave them in the comments. If you want to personally reach out to us, there's an email address in the show notes.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we're going to read it openly on the next episode. That means you can ask away. If you know us personally, reach out to us that way. I will include this guy's socials in the bio, as well as, if I remember, putting stuff for Small Town Monsters, stuff we've both worked on down there. If you want to just see what kind of level-headed cryptozoology it can look like. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back next week.
Every Sunday morning, I'm in service.
I never know how to refer to you on shows that we do together. We just did a episode of The Only Problem together.
Yes.
And I didn't know.
Yeah, that was
Dad.
an interesting,
I never knew what to
intro.
do.
Yes.